Well, I hope everyone's having a good afternoon. It ends now. No, I jest. We kid right here. What I wanted to do, it's kind of weird, and I need to ask something of you to indulge me. I want you to stay with me because we're going to go over a lot of stuff that you're going to think, what does this have to do with the Bible? Where's the Devo? But if you stick with me, at the very end, we're going to hopefully make all this make sense. Okay, that's the plan anyway. And before we get started, I did want to tell you this is basically what I did my thesis on at Freed when I graduated. So a lot of what I'm talking about, my thesis was like 200 pages, and this is, just hopefully 15 to 20 minutes, which is hard to do. So I do have notes here, not to tell me what to say, but don't say anything outside of these notes because there's just so much information to go about. In antiquity, antiquity is about probably from the 8th century BC to really about the fall of Rome. So it's, from the 8th century BC to 476 AD. That's what's considered antiquity, that classical Greek period that falls right in with the 1st century and, the New Testament that we have. So that's why, in one sense, it's very important to study this area because we study the Bible, we want to see when Paul wrote Corinth, what were the Corinthians thinking at the time? What was their background? How did they interpret what Paul was sending them, and so forth? So I think it's important. So what we're going to really study here is what is beneficial for teaching. Now this debate's been going on for thousands of years. If you've heard the news, that even in Australia, they have passed a law to limit social media for 16-year-olds and under, I think after 10 p.m. or something. Why? Because the stuff that they're looking at is not beneficial, you see. We do it in classrooms all the time. The societies, I don't know, Lucian probably has more idea of this, they get together and they make these textbooks, and what they're trying to figure out is what is beneficial for teaching. What should we teach the young people in society? But this actually started a long time ago. Predomitus said this is in 110 BC, he stated the composition should express a thought that is useful. Now what he's talking about is this idea that anything written, anything taught should be useful. And it's this Greek word, phelemos. This Greek word phelemos. What is useful? What is beneficial for teaching? And so as we go through this, we want to look at a couple of major points here. Aristotle, who lived during this time, is called the father of literary criticism. Now, this criticism meant that they would look at stuff that were written and criticize it. Here today, when you hear about somebody being criticized, we usually think of it as negative. But back then, it just meant to judge. So, positive, negative. They would just, this is good, this is not good, this is why it's not good, this is why it is good. So they would judge all the literary, all the teaching stuff that was going on during this time. And Aristotle is the father of that. Now, important in our study, too, is to understand the spread of Hellenism, or the spread of the Greek culture, which really goes to Alexander the Great, where he conquered all of this land in 334 to 323 BC. You'll see he started here in Greece and went all the way to India. Now, even today in India, there are these statues and other carvings that has Greek letters in it, all the way in India. And so they went all the way back here, and that's kind of the spread of the Greek culture. Part of culture is, of course, language. So the Greek language is spreading through here. And they taught things like the gods, how to do a democracy, the establishment of a city, and all that comes to play here. Also, this idea of education. the Greeks had a thought that through this idea of studying what is beneficial for teaching, they believed that you could actually educate a young person, and that young person could grow up and morph into an outstanding character. That it wasn't just nature that would do this, that you had to teach them something beneficial so that they would be able to do something. They did this through, we would say, they call it a gymnasium, okay? These teaching institutions, they would do sports, they would teach music, they would teach history, education, religion, all these things here. And so they use this idea called pandia. Comes from the Greek word pas, which means child. So it meant to this education idea to do that. Now the vehicle they would use to educate all their people were poets. And Greeks loved their poets. Now we got to think about a poetry and poet differently than we do today. This was not as I lay in the grassy field and the sun radiates and hits my skin, I think of my lovely Penelope, right? That's not what this is. This is more like maybe Job would be something we're more familiar with. If you read Job, Job is nothing like that, but what section of the Bible is that? Poetry, okay? Poetry section. And so these ideas of these poets would be the educators of the Greek. Now, Homer was the premier, the main teacher of the Greeks. Oh, not this one, but this one. Okay, this Homer. Now, if you're familiar with, the Odyssey, the Iliad, this is what Homer wrote. And he wrote it in the 8th century BC. This is how it's written in Greek, Homeros. Here in this map you see, this is the world of the Iliad. This is when he wrote about the Ilians. This whole area is called the Illystrians. That's why it's called the Iliad. Went up here to Troy, and they had that little skirmish there. Now, interesting enough, up until about the late 1800s, everyone thought Troy was a mythical, fictional city. Like it didn't exist. Okay, Homer wrote about it. And the time period he wrote, again, is the 8th century, but the events happened in Iliad and Odyssey, and Troy was about 1100 to 1200 BC, years later. So this guy, he was a kind of Russian, German, American named Schliemann. He wanted to dig up and find Troy, and he did. He went there, and Troy they found was in several layers. And they said layer 7 is about the time of Homer's Iliad here. Now, as a side note, Schliemann was a rich man, but not an archaeologist. So he just kind of massively dug up stuff and didn't do it very well and so forth. And he gets criticized for that a lot. All right, let's see. As we think about Homer being the educator, he's called a didaskalian. And if you're familiar in the education world, you may be familiar with the word didactic. If something is didactic, that means that it's educational. And Homer was known as the educator of the Greeks. And he is known as also, we're going to a little bit talk about divine and entertainer and so forth. Now, this guy here, Dionysius, says that Homer was the most credible and most ancient of all witnesses writing here during this time. This just kind of gives you a feel of how they viewed Homer, okay? How Homer was the main person that the Greeks would use to teach with. Plato wrote that Homer was the poet, the the poetes. The poetes. Now, poem is the Greek word poeo, which means to make. Okay, so in ancient times, a poet was a maker of things, of literature and so forth. And so even Aristotle said that just as Homer was the supreme poet of elevated subjects, and there's just many, many, many different things that can be said about Homer as we talk about this. Xenophon said that Homer has practically written everything pertaining to man. You see how. Now, as we go through this, hopefully some bells are going off to think, wow, that's how we view the Bible, you see. This is the point I want you to start to ascertain here. Homer was used for military, okay? If there was going to be a great battle, they would consult Homer and see how his battle strategy was, and they would imitate it. They would pull medicine out of their virtues and honors. They would look at Achilles and say, man, wasn't he brave? He was a brave man. When Alexander went to conquer the world, Aristotle made him a copy of Homer, and it said that Alexander would lay Homer on his bed, put a pillow on it, and then sleep on it, hoping that Homer would seep into his mind, you see. And Alexander the Great kind of thought he was a Achilles reincarnated, okay, that sort of thing. A lot of crazy stuff going on these antiquity people. By 423 BC, the idea of knowing Homer was unacceptable. One must memorize Homer. So what they would do every 4 years, they had something called the Great Anathenia, which is a contest. And what they would do is they would have if you signed up, you could recite Homer. You'd start here in the first part and start reciting, and if you messed up, the next person took over, and they would do this. Now, between the Iliad and the Odyssey, there's over 30,000 lines, but these people would memorize it. And this idea of memory was very important to the Greeks because they studied Homer. Now, what other book can you think about that we learn verses today? The Bible, right? And that's what I want you to kind of get as we go along here. So the first thing that a Greek student would learn is this phrase: a god, not a man, was Homer. Here, in fact, is a ancient tablet that they found. This is how it's written here. It starts here, and it kind of goes off here. It's kind of broken here. And Lewis, that kind of looks like my handwriting back then, you know. So this is broken down as theos, uk, anthropos, Homer, I guess, let's see, here we go. If we had to write it out, it would be a god, but this is really more a Greek word of God-like, not man. Anthropos, the Greek word for man, is where we get our word anthropology. Anthropos, homeros. So, first thing that we learned was a god, not a man, was Homer. This is a plaque that was made in Alexandria by Archelaus, and in 225 BC. And you see here, that's Zeus, in case you didn't know what he looked like. He's a lazy fella. And these are some muses and some Greek gods. I want you to really go on this circle here, what we're seeing here. This part is showing a couple of people bringing a bull to sacrifice. Here we got, one of these is going to be Ptolemy, one of the leaders of Egypt. The other one is going to be the goddess of called Cronus, which is the god of time, where we got a word chronology. And here there's a crown. This man is holding a scepter, and he's got a scroll here, and this man is Homer. They're crowning him kind of leader of the scrolls, the writing and the literature. Plato said that whenever a poet is seated on the muses tripod, he is not in his senses but resembles a fountain which gives free course to the upward rush of water. Now what they're explaining here is inspiration. Because what it was, when Homer wrote this, everyone thought, how in the world could anyone write this? I can't do it. How do we do it? So they would try to make this idea that it was the gods and the goddesses and the muses that would give them inspiration, okay? Because no one could really write this on their own. Today, we would just call it talent, right? These ancient Greek writers. But the problem is that when they do this, you see, now they're given almost a God-like instructions of what they're writing. So that's why Homer was taken in as literal doctrine, if you will. They viewed inspiration as madness. And in fact, the Greek word for madness is mantis. And it's where we get our word madness, the Greek word mantis here. And here Plato describes it as a kind of art leading of the soul. Now this word is sukiago. And it's kind of interesting because here is suke, this is soul, and here is kind of agogo, which is leading the way, or leading a way pretty much. So it's hard to see here, but Plato's actually condemning Homer in some sense, because he says what Homer writes, it leads the soul somewhere else. Now, if we were going to translate this word into English, this would be the word. Entertainment. So again, what's beneficial for teaching? Well, we got to stop entertaining because Plato said it has no useful value, you see. So everyone cancel your Netflix account because that's just entertainment. It's not useful. Okay, moving right along. Incidentally, I wanted to mention that there's also a picture that someone describes that they saw. We don't have it today, but I hope everyone's lunch has settled as I say this. But there's a picture of Homer vomiting, and it shows little other poets picking up his pieces. Disgusting. Well, or you could say his words were flowing out like a fountain and this. Okay, anyway, so that's kind of some ideas that can make everyone sick, but yet we can learn something. Strabo and Eratosthenes, we're all familiar with both of these fellas. Strabo was look here, this is first century, you see. He wrote several books on geography. He was a geographer. Eratosthenes lived in Alexandria. He was one of the Alexandrian editors. He was also a mathematician. A lot of these poets back then were mathematicians. They were very engaged in civil activity. They also wrote a lot of stuff, and they were critics of other people's poetry as well. Today, most critics don't even try poetry, they just criticize it. Eratosthenes went down to Upper Egypt, which would actually be south, measured some shadows, went back to Alexandria, measured some shadows. He did math. Using math, he measured the circumference of the earth. And today, he was only 2% off. That's how smart they were. Strabo criticizes negatively Eratosthenes because he says, you know what, Homer writes all this stuff in the Odyssey, and he goes around telling about all these places, but they don't exist. He's just making it up. Strabo rakes Eratosthenes over the coals. He says, you shouldn't criticize Homer for this because when Homer says this, this is why he does it. He's using allegory or he's wanting to be entertaining and so forth. Now, the point being, and I have this section in my thesis, is that Strabo defends Homer like we would the Bible. Okay, that's how much he thinks Homer's scripture, you see, and you shouldn't be criticizing good old Homer. What'd he ever do to you? This is an actual picture of the Library of Alexandria. No, it's just a depiction. It's not real. But you see, the library in Alexandria where Eratosthenes and Zodontanus and Callimachus all worked. These are scrolls that the library would accumulate, and a lot of it was Homer. They'd studied Homer. They would look at the editions. They would look at this edition. They would figure out which one's best. They would write different editorial comments about it and so forth. So they studied Homer extensively. This was their mantra, their motto, to clarify Homer from Homer. Again, very similar, we would do the Bible. We want to look at a Bible verse and don't understand it, we go somewhere else in the Bible to clarify that. Now, unfortunately, these scrolls are dry and brittle and they catch on fire. So the library in Alexandria burned down. However, there was two main libraries there, so people don't know if both of them got burned down or just one of them, but we do know you shouldn't be smoking in these libraries. Now, one thing that the library in Alexandria had were books of magic. Now, we shouldn't be thinking about magic like witches and vampires and all that true stuff. No, I'm just kidding. All that bad stuff, right, that doesn't exist. But how to use certain verses to manipulate things, put curses on people, things like that. They had many of those, plus Alexandria. Now, let's bring some Bible into this. You remember in Ephesus when Paul's there preaching and he does he gets rid of some demons and they all cause a ruckus. And there in Acts around 19, it says that all the people were convinced and they got all their books of magic. And what did they do with them? They burned them. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that these come from Alexandria, but the library was already destroyed probably by this time. So, but there was a lot of this stuff going around in this time period. Now, look at this. This is quoted here. The Sadducees say, "We complain against you, Pharisees, because you say that the Holy Scriptures defile the hands, but the books of Homer do not defile the hands." And I got to catch up in my notes here. Now, interesting enough, where this comes from. This is from the Mishnah of the Jews in the Yadayim, chapter 4. Now, I won't get in the context of this, but, anyway. But the main point here I want to make is that the book of Homer is actually mentioned in rabbinical literature. Josephus mentions Homer. Josephus mentions Homer, how the Greeks really love him. There's different variations of Homer that goes around and so forth. You can read about that. We don't have time. I did want to mention that Homer was so revered that every city, every country claimed ownership of Homer. Homer was born here in this city. How do you know? Well, here's his birth certificate. So every place claimed him. This was some of the ones more reputable that claimed him, this island of Chios. There was also saying that he actually lived and wrote Homer from a cave. I think it's called the Malayas River here. This is a modern-day Turkey and Izmir, which is near the old Smyrna. But they say that he's from here. And if you look at this map, you see how this island Chios is very near this. But then also, we have Ephesus here. And we've already mentioned Ephesus we know they had magic books, right? And so you see all this area is kind of just too coincidental to say. So no one actually believes that Homer was from Greece. Okay, he come from these Greek areas here of Turkey, probably, because they know that because of well, y'all don't care. But anyway, they come from the language, it's Ionic, it's not Doric Greek. Oh, great, we're near the end. Isn't that great for you guys? So one can easily say that Homer was the Bible to the Greeks, okay? Again, different than what we would think about it, but for the Greeks, they didn't know anything about what we know today, so that's just the way it is. This Homer says, wow, really? Okay. Okay, moving right along. Let's see what we got. So at this point, some people may be asking questions yourself, and I think this is what everyone's thinking. So what? Why did I come this afternoon? How does this help me? Why did Jeremy waste my time? Can I fake a sickness and leave now? Isn't it time for my nap? Okay, I know. Just stick with me. These are actually I'm asking these myself. So here's we think about this. We know that Paul writes Timothy 2 letters, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Timothy is in what city? Ephesus, yes. Right? All right. Well, so this is my point, that this is why Paul can write Pasa grapha theanastas kai ophelimos pros didaskalion, or commonly this. So the point of my thesis was that this phrase, ophelimos pros didaskalion, was a Greek phrase that had been studied, debated for years, and what Paul was doing is getting into that debate to tell these Greeks that for years you used Homer. Now, let's think about this. Homer was a textbook for the children. Paul knew Greek. Paul knew Homer, okay? And so he says, yeah, you want to know what's profitable for teaching? Forget about the Homer. Forget about all this other Greek stuff you've been studying. What you should be looking for is Scripture that is breathed out by God. You want to use Homer for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness? Use the Bible. Use Scripture that's inspired by God. Forget about Homer. Go to the Bible. This. And of course, this is 2 Timothy 3:16. And so as we conclude, we want to ask Homer, what do you say, Homer? So that's it. Oh, that's the lesson. So part of the, again, my thesis of 200 pages was trying to understand that phrase, ophelimos pros didaskalion, that what is beneficial for teaching was a phrase debated years in Greek society, and Paul's making the point, now you're going to use the Bible as your instruction instrument for reproof, correction, instruction of righteousness. Thank you for your time.